All right, thank you for listening to this podcast. This episode of Literally is sponsored by Lexicon and Line. Case, tell us a little something about Lexicon and Line.
Lexicon and Line, it does three things. They are communications consultants. They teach professional business writing and speaking courses, and they are research and data evaluation experts.
And you can find everything about Lexicon and Line at lexicononline.com. Please give them a visit, and thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast, Lexicon and Line. Confronting authors with real questions about the writing process, the difficult and disheartening publishing industry, and why anyone would choose to torture themselves in the world of writing, this is the Literally Podcast with your host, writer, runner, and the literary voice of Ogden, Utah, Case Johnston. Exposing literature, the authors, the business, the process. The Literally Podcast.
All right, so I'm going to be reading from Finding Abbey, and I'm going to read a section later on in the book. It's called Abbey Country. And just to set you up, what's going on is my best friend House and I are heading out into the desert to begin the search for Edward Abbey's hidden desert grave. This takes place October 16th, and we're somewhere out in the desert. It starts with a quote from the Colorado-based writer David Peterson: "A secret too much revealed loses all its magic." In late evening, House and I stumble exhausted back to the Jeep. Even after a long day of failure in our search for Abbey's grave, we smile because we have traveled far within this great desert in search of something larger than a grave. As we swallow huge gulps of water blanketed by the hot night air, we talk about our plan for tomorrow, our final day of searching. Since today we scoured the two areas where we hoped Abbey's grave would be, we shrug our shoulders as we talk about where next to search. We don't have a clue. Finally, House and I decide on a whim to search a wild card spot tomorrow, a spot neither of us had ever anticipated traveling to, a spot we had never envisioned as we thought about our search for Abbey's grave. But we have nothing left. We were wrong in our planning. Our clues have failed us. We're out of options and running out of time. House needs to fly to Colorado in 15 hours. So on the edge of the dark of night, we climb into the Jeep. And after a quiet day with only a few birds and the subtle breeze as company, we are startled by the snarl of the engine. I put the Jeep in gear and drive. We cover a distance. Is it a single mile or 1,000 miles from last night's camp? Distances are so tricky in the desert. We park on a dirt road. When I shut off the Jeep's engine, we were parked deep inside Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, where Abbey had said he wanted to be buried. We're still in the Sonoran Desert, so the clues I've compiled still make sense. Before the engine is cooled, we realize that it must be Saguaro National Park, near Abbey's Tucson home, where he's buried. That's actually the only thing that makes sense. So we raced northward and arrived just as the sky goes crazy with sunrise. And just as we're about to begin our saguaro search, one of us, maybe House, decodes a new clue and discovered that Abbey's even closer to Tucson, somewhere he could have been carried immediately after his death. So we race off to Ina Road, where we head for a spot where Abbey first tried to die. Yes, this must be it. And everything about being buried in the Cabeza Prieta was just Abbey's friends monkey wrenching one more time. But as soon as we drive to Ina Road, we realize that our clues are wrong, so we weave our way up and over Mount Lemmon to Oracle. No, actually to Wolf Hole. Abbey never lived in either of those spots, though he claimed to in his books, but that's where he must be buried. He finally makes those places home. Or in the dead of night, we realize that the Tucson region is all wrong. So we race past a Phoenix night that glows like a supernova. Tonight, brilliant, but soon about to fade away to nothing. We drive past Flagstaff before dawn and fall asleep as the sun breaks over the gaping yawn of the Grand Canyon. And this is where we find Abbey's grave, right here, because Abbey once in 1949 almost died in a side canyon of Havasu Canyon, trapped on a remote ledge without rope. What better place to call your final home than where you once almost lost your life? Or maybe we leave the Cabeza Prieta and drive all night with the hammer down, sneaking into Arches National Park at dawn on Willow Flats Road. We park outside the workstation, realizing Amy, the SCA volunteer from Arches, was right about Abbey being buried beneath that pile of gravel where his trailer once sat. Or he's buried, we realize, at Dead Horse Point, overlooking the Colorado River. Or he's buried in LaSalle's, where the sun lingers longest. Tukhanukovitz. So we race there and start towards a peak, realizing that we'll find the grave just as the sun starts to settle upon the peak. But after all the miles of driving, we come to see that after all these locations are ghost chases leading us nowhere. So we park at the top of Combe Ridge, and during the midnight hour, we hike past ancestral Puebloan ruins, only to realize we're in the wrong canyon and we need to drop into the frigid waters of the black hole of White Canyon near that damned Lake Fowl, where we search the banks of every river we can name, the Rio Grande, the Green, the San Juan, the Colorado, the Dolores. And on our way to the San Juan River, we decide to park on the edge of Cedar Mesa and hike into Grand Gulch. Tomorrow we'll search Collins Canyon. We'll find either Everett Roos's or Abby's grave down there. Either will be the discovery of a lifetime. But no, we realize again, all of these places are wrong. Abby's grave is in the maze. How could we not have realized? Now we just need to find a way in and a way back out. Or the grave is right under our noses. Wherever we drive to, wherever we end up, we wake the next morning as deep in Abbey country as one can get. David Peterson spoke of this idea of Abbey country during our interview in Durango. He said every place that Ed ever was, that he ever wrote about, the whole Moab area, southeastern Utah, Cedar Mesa, the Sonoran Desert. Since people didn't know where Ed was buried, his spirit was there. Peterson went on, I can't go to any of those places today, especially the canyon country, without feeling Ed's spirit. He's the closest thing to a real ghost I've ever known. Peterson continued, but Ed is buried in Abbey country. Ed is buried in the kind of place that he loved, that he spent his life in, that he wrote about, that you may know, that you may love. That's where Ed's buried. He's buried in the American Southwest in Abbey country. And as House and I step out of the Jeep, we realize that Dave is right. Abby's ghost, his spirit, his presence is everywhere in the West. I felt Abby's ghostly presence in Arches National Park as I drove in long lines of industrial and tourists. I felt it when I gazed upon the American-Mexican border and saw where economic refugees trickled across the dividing line. I felt Abby's presence in the slot canyons and needles, and even in the cities that he called home. It's as if his words, his ideas have settled down upon all the lands of the American West. And since Abby and I can feel his presence almost everywhere, we choose a spot because it's deepest in Abbey country. We choose a spot because it's centered within the myth of the American West. We choose a spot where we feel the presence of Abby like a ghost. The spot we choose is chosen almost at random because just about anywhere out here is infused with Abby's spirit. Almost anywhere could be the perfect home for Abby's grave. All of the American West is his resting spot.
This is Case Johnston. This is the Literally Podcast. We're broadcasting from my home in Ogden, Utah. Today, our guest is Sean Prentiss, the author of Finding Abbey and many other things. Sean Prentiss is the award-winning author of Finding Abbey, A Search for Edward Abbey and His Hidden Desert Grave, a memoir about Edward Abbey and the search for home. Finding Abbey won the 2015 National Outdoor Book Award for History Biography, the Utah Book Award for Nonfiction, and the New Mexico Arizona Book Award for Biography. It was also a Vermont Book Award and Colorado Book Award finalist. Prentiss is the series editor for the Bloomsbury Publishing Writers Guide series. This textbook line focuses on creative writing. 2 books, Environmental and Nature Writing, a craft guide, and anthology, and advanced creative nonfiction, forthcoming in 2022, are written by Prentiss. Prentiss is also the co-editor of The Far Edges of the Fourth Genre, Explorations in Creative Nonfiction, a creative nonfiction craft anthology, and the co-editor of the forthcoming book, The Science of Story, The Brain Behind Creative Nonfiction, forthcoming in 2019 from Bloomsbury. He's also the author of the poetry manuscript Crosscut, a trail-building memoir and poems, coming in 2020 from the University of New Mexico Press. He and his family live on a small lake in northern Vermont, and he serves as an associate professor at Norwich University and is a faculty member in the MFA Writing and Publishing program at Vermont College of Fine Arts. Sean has done a lot when it comes to Utah. Right. I mean, of course, with this book, with Finding Abbey, obviously, a lot of it is rooted in Utah, where Abbey, for those of you who don't know, who listen to this podcast, who are not familiar with Abbey, if you're from Utah, I shame you. If you are not from Utah, you may not know so much about him. But Abbey has placed himself, obviously, at the center of the canon of Western writing. And he is kind of a cornerstone of Utah literature as well. And within Sean's reading, he talks about this idea of crossing the desert. And one of my initial questions was, and he crazily enough picked an excerpt that led into, what does it mean to traverse the desert? You know, this idea of going into where so many people don't think that there is life. And I mean, looking at Abby's expert water, you know this one where he says there's always enough water in the desert to survive. There's just not enough water for people to build and develop in that desert. And it makes me think about Abby in that way with the piece that you selected. And the question is, within traversing the desert, when did you come to that kind of realization that it doesn't matter if we find the grave because Abby's grave is truly everywhere? Was it that day, or was it throughout the journey?
It was throughout the journey. It was actually much earlier in the process. I remember when my friend gave me the book idea. So I did not come up with this idea on my own. My friend Steve Coughlin, a wonderful poet from Nebraska, said, you should write a book about finding Abby's grave. And pretty soon thereafter, I thought that if it matters if I find the grave or not, then I'm not doing my job as a writer. And what really matters is the search for it. And whatever I find at the end should not determine success or failure of the book. Mm-hmm. And that was, a really nice thing to realize, because all of a sudden then I could enjoy the process and not worry about if I found the grave. And a lot of the people that, I'm associated with, including House in the book, my best friend and my wife, who was my girlfriend at the time, they didn't want me to find the grave. They wanted it to remain a mystery. Mm-hmm. And I won't let you know if I found the grave or not. But I always liked that idea of, people actively hoping that I don't find it as I went searching for it. But yeah, so from the very beginning, I realized that if it's about the grave, then there's a problem with my writing.
Mm-hmm. It ends the exploration, right? I mean, or the purpose of it.
Yeah, and it's not about a grave. It's about figuring out what to do with my life. It's figuring out what I can learn from Abby. It's figuring out where I should live and what I should do for work. And none of that has to do with finding a grave. Finding a grave is just the impetus. And I mean, think about just about every single book we've ever read. We say the cliche, it's not the destination, it's the journey, because it's the truth.
Right. And for those who haven't read it, and you should read it, where does this all begin? Because it begins when you take a tenure track job and you feel as if you're not quite ready to be there.
Yeah, I was born in Pennsylvania, just like Abby, and then I spent almost 20 years out west. Most of it, I've worked in almost every Western state and lived in a whole bunch of them, but Colorado and Idaho are probably my two longest. And then I moved to a city far away from all the mountains, and I realized really quickly that I just struggled in cities, and I really struggle not seeing mountains. Mm-hmm. And I had this wonderful job at a wonderful school. I had a beautiful house, and I felt completely without home and without place. And so that's where it all began, with me trying to figure out, you have a tenure track job. It's so hard to get, and it's so hard to get a second one. And I was just worried, especially back then, I didn't have a book out. So if I gave up this job, I would probably give up my academic career. So then I'd have to find some new career at 38 years old. And I figured I'd become a carpenter. Mm-hmm. Not that I was very talented in that, but I figured, well, maybe I can learn. And so I figured, well, before I just quit my job, let me try to figure out what I should do first. And then that's when I pieced together that with the idea my friend Steve gave me of searching for Abby's grave. And I said, oh, yeah, I should go searching for Abby's grave, one, as a way to get out of the city. Mm-hmm. But then two, Abby lived all across the country and often would leave the desert and would fail spectacularly. And then he'd quit whatever he was doing, marriages or teaching jobs, and go racing back to what he felt like was his home. And I thought, well, let me ask Abby. But he had died, many years before that in '89. So I thought, well, I'll read his work and I'll follow in his path and see what I can learn from his life and his writings.
Yeah. It feels the journey itself, like you discussed with the writing, is really, there's two narratives here, right? I mean, you're looking with this book, you're looking at this journey for yourself of getting away from a place that you thought that you always wanted to be with the tenure track job and with this good school, to finding where you want to be, but at the same time, the dual narrative of going and actively pursuing a piece of dirt, basically, which is
Yeah.
a really interesting way to look at it. And when you were writing this with the dual narrative, did you know that it was going to take this shape initially, or did you think it might come across in a different way, or was it something you were dealing with while you were writing it?
I think the one big surprise about its form is how much of a biography it ended up being.
Right.
And, if you were to ask me in grad school if I'd ever write anything closely resembling a biography, I would have laughed. I mean, that's the furthest skill set I have. And if you would have ever asked me if I'd be diving into special collections libraries and interviewing people and doing all of this more traditional academic style research, and my reading list for this was probably 60 to 90 books tall.
Yeah.
And, so that was the biggest surprise. I knew I could put together some sort of travelogue. I knew I could do the personal essay, at least to my level, but I never had any idea that so much of the biography would get in there. But I was just learning that as I was reading about Abbey and from Abbey, that we started having a conversation, and he would pose an idea, and then I would think about it for a while, and then I'd throw a question out there, and somewhere in my reading I'd find an answer from Abbey.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really wanted that to get in the book as much as possible, because if I'm searching for his grave, there's a reason for it, and it was because I felt like I could learn about my place in this world from one of my elders, and one of the people that taught me more about writing than anyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's Abbey's interesting in that way, in the sense that for those who love him, they love him.
Mm-hmm.
For those who don't, they don't.
Mm-hmm.
When you started this, did your views change of him as a writer and as a person when you began to when you finished? I mean, was after doing all the reading and then going out and doing the journey, did your impression of him as a writer and as yourself as a writer, as a person, change throughout that until the end? I mean, well, once you finished up.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm going to stretch all the way back to when I first read Abbey. That was 1994, and House, he gave me Desert Solitaire, and then quickly I started tearing through as many Abbey books as I could get my hands on. And back then, especially, I was drawn to this hyper masculine voice.
Yeah.
And deep bouts of solitude in the desert, emotional highs and lows, romances, all of that. And I think back then I wasn't very smart about how I read Abbey. And I read him as a young man loving a man's voice in the desert.
Sure.
And then I went to grad school, and that taught me a whole lot. And I got older, and that taught me a whole lot. And then I did all this research, and that taught me a whole lot. And, I think for a long time, I really struggled with, there are spots where, I don't know if, I normally say where it sounds like he's misogynistic, or it sounds like he's racist, or it sounds like he's xenophobic. Mm-hmm. But I don't know if the sounds like is fair. Like some of those statements just are racist statements.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I never met Abbey, so I don't know if those statements are a true testament to who Abbey was, or if they're a testament to the voice he was trying to have in his writing. And he talked a lot about, and so did his friends, about how there's two voices. There's Abbey, the writer, mm-hmm. and you would imagine if he came into this interview, he would take it over, and he'd be loud and obnoxious, and he'd be having a beer, but it might be his third or his fourth or his fifth. But then his friends always talked about when he was in a room, he was one of the quietest people in the room. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if those statements were Abbey or if those were Abbey's persona on the page. And then as I talked to his friends more, as I thought more about it, what I think about is all the silly things I've said. And if you were to deep dive into my emails or some of my conversations when I was younger or more inebriated, mm-hmm. what would you dig up? And you dig up some things that don't shine on me as nicely as I'd like.
Yeah.
And does that make me a bad person? I'll let you could decide that. But I think what I settled on is that when I talk to Abbey's friends, I've never met people 20, almost 25 years removed from their friend's death, who without prompting were just so willing to defend him and so full of love for him. Mm-hmm. And these are some of the smartest people I've ever run into.
Yeah.
And so I think what I realized is he's a human, and he's an artist, and he's a marketer in the sense that he's trying to sell a voice and an idea. And he's not perfect, but he's human. And I love that about him. He's willing to take risks, and I don't agree with all of its risks. But I agree with his ideas that, like you were saying earlier, the West is overdeveloped. America is overdeveloped. Climate change is an issue. I think Abbey would have definitely agreed with that. And he would have decided, I believe, that it came out of overpopulation across the globe and across America, and that we need to reduce our population, to reduce our consumption, and live more gently upon the West and upon places like Vermont, where I'm at right now.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that you took that with you? I mean, for yourself in this, I mean, you mentioned that, hey, I understand that he has the writer persona and the personal persona.
Yeah.
Is there a different Sean with the writer persona from the book and from you sitting here talking to us now, or removed when you're by the lake in Vermont?
Well, there definitely is now, because now I'm happily married with a 2-year-old daughter,
right,
in the place that I call home, and I hope to die in this home.
Mm-hmm.
So when I was writing the book, all of those things were missing. So I've changed that way. But what I'm a teacher like you are, and I always push my students to take risks. And I say, emotionally put yourself out there on a page, and I demand that they are brave. And then I always think of what a hypocrite I am, because there's just a lot of things I refuse to write about on the page, because I'm just not willing to put my family in harm's way at all. So, if my wife and I have a discussion that might make a good essay, it's not going to become an essay.
Yeah.
My life, for me, is more important than my writing, and not many things are. So, Abbey was willing to put his writing first, and I'm just amazed at that, and I honor that, and I tell my students to do that, and I just don't. And I want to say I wish I did, but my family is more important than that.
Yeah, no, I understand completely. I used to, my first few essays that were published, I wish I could take back a lot of times, because they're too, and now I, just along the same line, and just if there's anything with my wife, it's like I'm clearing it through her. Like, it's like, well, how did you see it? Did we see it the same way? Are we on the same page? This essay is basically coming from us. It's going to be our voice looking on the page, and it's because you're right. It's you can hurt people, and that's the last thing in the world when you're close to people that you want to do. Thinking about Abbey still with these dual personas, where do you think he would belong today? Like, from all your research, where do you think he would belong? Because it's different, right? I mean, it's different than the 60s in Arches, and like you said, industrial tourism was your words, and it's true. You go into Arches and it's a line of cars, and then people. That's the most frustrating part for me, because Zion, luckily they now have the tram that you can go in, and they limit the amount of people. Where do you think Abbey would belong today, like if you were writing him?
So Abbey is an anarchist, and I think his big idea on that was that a true anarchist is a member of a very small localized community. So it's not that they don't believe in rules, it's that they believe in the rules of a landscape and of a culture based out of that landscape. So he's very much anti-large government, so he would have been a libertarian. Mm-hmm. And now it just depends on where. He was anti-immigration. He believed in that there should be a border wall. Yeah. And, that fits in perfectly with Trump, but I'm 99% sure that Abbey would have despised Trump. Mm-hmm. And they would have agreed on stopping immigration, but they would have agreed on that premise for very, very different reasons. Trump has his ideas. Abbey's was all about population control. Mm-hmm. It was about keeping the land as protected as possible from, the industrialized tourism and just the industrialized nation. So where would he fit? He would not be a Republican. He would not be a Democrat, but he would be, maybe a green libertarian. And, he'd be calling for more wilderness still. He'd be calling for control of immigration, and maybe not in the most politically correct ways. But he would also be just, taking lots and lots of shots at the Trump's administration's abuse of the land and the air and climate. Mm-hmm. And he would be firmly entrenched opposed to those ideas, while saying that we need to look at each community separately. And the desert Southwest should be developed differently than Vermont. It's just, they're two different places and they should have two different governments.
That's really interesting to hear, especially like where the current administration would line up with him, but of course for completely different reasons, Yeah. And he would, of course, with the stuff with what's happening in the South, in southern Utah here with our national monuments and stuff, I'm guessing Abbey would be on the front lines to protect them. But for a different reason than maybe I would, right? I mean,
well, and I'm thinking about Bundy out in Nevada, I believe it was, with the Sagebrush Rebellion, which is a localized group of men and women taking back land for their community. And there's a recent UPenn master's student named Eric Dells who did a wonderful project on Abbey. And he brings this up and he talks about this idea that it sure seems like Abbey would be on their side, but then Abbey hated modern ranchers.
Yeah.
He called them welfare cattlemen. Mm-hmm. So, whenever you think you pin Abbey down, he moves it. So is he for the localized community? Well, maybe. It depends on what they stand for. Is he for more federal lands? Maybe. It depends on what they're doing with it. If they're turning it into a national park and paving it, probably not. If they're turning it to a wilderness area, hey, maybe. So he's a moving target, but his big ideas always come down to how do you defend the land from us, the people?
Right. Right, and I think a lot of times it comes down. I mean, I think if he were alive today and people tried to use his voice to say something, he'd probably be the first one to say, "Knock it off! You're getting me wrong, or I'm going to." Yeah. You're not saying for the reason I am. I mean,
yeah,
which would be really interesting because it's a different time. I mean, it's a different time, but he predicted it, don't you think? In a lot of ways, especially like arches and so on and so forth, all down south.
Yeah, I mean, industrialized tourism, go to any national park. I was just reading stats. I wish I could remember them. I'm terrible with remembering numbers. But, I mean, parks are just buckling under the weight of us. Mm-hmm. And, same with state parks, same with wilderness areas. We're just killing the land to death. But then, I think about Vermont in the 1800s when we were 90 or 85% deforested. The Green Mountain State had no green left. Huh. And, if you watch the path of humanity moving across America, it's that same tale. And, you go back to Frederick Jackson Turner and the frontier is closed and we're just filling up every single spot. And Abbey saw that coming and we see it coming.
My brother was calling me right at the right moment. It's really interesting. First off, I think somebody needs to be, and this should be you, needs to do a book on Abbey's wives.
Oh yeah.
I mean, he's had 4 or was it 5?
He's had 5.
5 wives. I mean, I think, and then he always went back.
Vodka in Utah, by the way.
It is Utah. It's just timing, right?
Yep.
But he went back to one of his wives at the very end, didn't he? I mean, he left her and then ended up going back to her right before death, didn't he? Something like that?
No, so let's see. I'm looking at my own book. So he married Jean in 1950 and divorced her in 52. And they married Rita in 52. And he was already dating her before they got married. So you can see what was happening there. Divorced her in 65. He had 2 kids with her. Married Judy in 65. She died in 1970. But he had already left her more or less before she died. And then he kind of came back and at least spent time with her. And then he married Renee in 73 and got divorced from her in 82. And that was down in Tucson. And then he met in Salt Lake, Clark, and that was in 82. So, there's seemingly that overlap there. And then he died on her in 89. But, from everything I know, he was with Clark those last 7 years. I think they had highs and lows, but I don't know of him ever leaving her for a previous wife.
One, yeah. But
I got a chance to meet Clark, and I'll tell you a quick story here just because it's a fun one. I was reading at Back and Beyond bookstores in Utah, which is one of my favorite bookstores in the country. And I remember going into that bookstore in the early to mid 90s and just seeing their Abbey collection and their Bowden collection, their Terry Tempest Williams collection, and just buying books. And they allowed me to give a reading there, and they almost didn't. I asked if I could read there, and Andy, the owner, said no. And I understood why, and it was because he thought I was writing a different book than I did. So I said, or I wrote him a long email. I said, Andy, I fully respect your right to say no to me. And if after this email you still want to say no, I'll still consider you one of my favorite bookstores. And I'll be sad, but I get it. You get to make that decision. And if you don't think I'm treating Abby fairly, then I've written the wrong book. And I sent him an email about what the book was about, how it's about the journey. It's not about the grave, right. How it's about a biography of Abby, all of that stuff. And he said, well, come on out. So I went out there to give a reading. And my wife, Sarah, came with me, and we did a tour of the Southwest and a bunch of readings. And I think that was our last one. And it was the one I was probably most excited and most nervous about. Mm-hmm. And I was most nervous about it because that's maybe the epicenter of Abbey country.
Right.
And I was really worried about who might show up. And one of the people I was worried about was Clark. And I was worried because there's been enough people who were worried about what this book was going to be about.
Yeah.
And I can tell you those stories as well. But I didn't know how she would take it. And I get to the bookstore, and I'm talking to Andy. He's wonderful. I'm loving it. There's a nice little crowd, and I'm about to go on. And Andy calls me over behind a rack of books, and he says, hey, Sean, I want you to meet someone. And I see it's a woman, and I just immediately break out into a sweat.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he says, Andy says, hey, this is Clark. Clark, this is Sean. And we have like a 2-minute conversation, and it's wonderful. But then I have to go read. And she sits down in the back next to my wife, and they just laugh through the entire reading and just talk to each other and mostly ignore me and my reading. But I was so happy to have gotten a chance to meet her, happy that my wife and her hit it off. And I can't say I see her tons, but anytime I do, she is just kind and gracious and wonderful. And I think this goes back to the earlier question about who Abby was and how he could have said some of those things. And again, I don't know, but I know the people that he surrounded himself with were just people with huge hearts. Mm-hmm. And Clark is like that. And, if she found, something in him strong enough to love, then, he's a great man on a lot of levels, because she was a great, great woman from everything, I got to see when I hung out with her. And I hope to hang out with her anytime I go out west.
Yeah, that probably had to feel like a great stamp of approval, or almost just a relief, right? When after she was there and listened to you read and was happy with it, and she was probably more happy talking to your wife than listening to you read, as you said. But that in itself probably had to feel pretty good that day. As books are, you run into people that your books affect, and it's scary. So that had to feel pretty good.
Yeah, it felt really good. And, you get book reviews for your book, for my book, and some people love it and some people hate it. And there's a lot of critics out there, and I get that. And I always talk to my students. I say, if you're going to do a book review, choose a book you love.
Yeah.
There's enough people that beat up books. And, we don't need, at least my opinion is, unless a book really is flawed philosophically or ethically, if you don't love it, just toss it to the side. You're not the reader for it.
Right.
But, my book had highs and lows. And the biggest joys for me were when, Clark continued to talk to me after the reading.
Yeah.
Or when Jack Loeffler, Abby's best friend, introduced me in Santa Fe. Or when, here's another reading story. I was reading out in Saguaro National Park, and I'm in the park, but outside of the main building. And I read this one section about Doug Peacock, and in it, Doug threatens my life. And I'm about to get to that section, and I see this guy coming in, and I'm reading and looking up and reading and looking up. And every time I look up, I think that, yes, he looks a little bit more like Doug Peacock.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to decide if I can read this section about him, more or less threatening to kill me out in the desert while he's here. And then I realize, wait, this is Doug Peacock. He'll love it if I read this about him. At least I assume. So I read it, and it is Peacock, and he comes up, and we hang out afterwards, and we go back to my friend Jeremy's house out in the desert, and we all have drinks. And, I just think that if Peacock and Loeffler and Clark think I caught some honest version of Abbey, and I don't always treat Abbey as the best writer in America or the best thinker in America. I talk about his flaws. Like, if they feel like I treated him fairly, and they're willing to share a beer or a conversation, then I've done what I set out to do.
Yeah, that's a success. Yeah, that's huge. That's huge. Do you think, since writing this book, I mean, and that's how it is with memoir. I mean, you wrap it up nice and pretty, but it's never nice and pretty. Since finishing it, going back, do you think you wished you would have written more, ended earlier or ended later with the autobiography, or with the biography as well, or the autobiography, or as with the journey itself? I mean, I know with my book, I was just glad to have it done. But I felt like, at that time in my life, there was a resolution. Since then, of course, that resolution's blown up, and but on the page, do you feel like that resolution is where you want it to be?
Yeah, I think the book does what I want the book to do. And I'm happy with that. The one thing I wish I could have done was to get more voices in. My favorite part of writing the book, and this is a shocker to me, was talking to Abby's friends and using those interviews. And I had this dream of writing, I'll call it writing another book, but it'd really be listening another book, where I just go and interview all of Abby's friends and as many of his wives or lovers or family members as I can, and just letting them have the final say on Abbey, and just putting together a collection of those interviews, because that was where I learned the most, was just talking to these men and women and learning from them. So that was my one regret, is that I didn't have more time and more money to just and the access. Right now I have a lot of access into Abbey's community. Back then, if you type my name into Google, I don't know what you would have found. It would have been almost nothing. So, why should Jack Loeffler give me an interview? Why should Doug Peacock waste his time on me? So I was so lucky to get anything I could. But, if I was doing it today, I would have the ability, I think, to reach out to a lot more of his friends and family. Yeah. And I would love just an addendum to the book where it's just, here are all the conversations.
Yeah. Yeah. Just raw. It's completely raw, just like a transcript of everything that they said.
Yeah.
And that actually goes to my next question when it comes to shaping, with this book. I mean, because of a lot of it deals with the journey, but then of course there's a lot of flashback in life for the biography and so on and so forth. When it comes to the shaping of it, did you have that in mind? Well, you already discussed it briefly before, that you didn't think there would be as much about you, as much memoir as you thought there would be, or personal memoir as you thought there would be. The distance itself, or not distance itself, but was along with the journey or outside the journey. With shaping, and you and I have talked about this a lot. I mean, when our short 5 days together in Colorado, we talked about nonfiction horribly. I mean, so much that you can't even think about it. And with the shaping, and this is for some of the people, because I share this with my students as well. I share my podcast with my students as well. With the shaping, how do you feel, because it covers a lot of time and so on, how would you explain to students the authenticity or the honesty of shaping a large amount of time into such a small book, into a book?
Yeah, it's a tricky beast. And first off, I'll tell your students that they're so lucky to learn from you.
Oh, I tell them every day.
All right, I take it back.
No,
I
I'm
don't
just
need
kidding.
to tell them.
I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding. Oh, yeah, go, sorry.
I just got back from Nonfiction Now, which was down in Phoenix. great conference, and it always forces me to reflect on truth and ethics in creative nonfiction. And I'm a hardliner
Me too.
where I believe that we need to tell the truth. And as soon as I talk about that hard line, I think about every single way in which I manipulate the truth of the experience. And, you know, my journey to Finding Abbey, I could talk for days about how I manipulate time, how I compress time, how I get rid of people, how with those interviews, you're talking about a big mess of a sprawling conversation.
Yeah.
And I could have just used that, but I think that works really well for a conversation. It doesn't work great for a book.
Mm-hmm.
And the reader is asking for a book. They're not asking for the rawness of life. The rawness of life is pretty darn boring. And we have got to be artists with that. So, being a hardliner, how do I balance that? And I guess I always try to just think about, would the person that I'm representing feel like this is an honest version of them? So David Peterson, Jack Loeffler, Doug Peacock, Ken Slight, as I don't change any of their words, I move some of them around. Would they feel that's fair? And I always share my writing with the people I'm writing about, just like you talked about, because it's more important that Dave Peterson feels like I represented him correctly. Even if, I make him sound like not the best guy, which I do. He's smart, and he didn't say anything that would make him sound anything like that. But, it's not about making someone sound better than they are. It's just making someone sound like their authentic self.
Mm-hmm.
So, I always share it with them so that they can say, yep, this is who I am. This is what I would have said. But then with Doug Peacock, I interviewed him at a different time than it is in the book. And it was after I was done with all my searching, and there was a pragmatic reason for that. And that was because Peacock would not interview me earlier because he didn't agree with my project until later. So, I could have put it after the search for Abby's grave, but it just doesn't work. And again, is that truthful to the experience? No. But I have to think about my readers. They don't want it afterwards because it just doesn't work.
Right.
So at the very, very beginning of the book, I give a little note about that. I just say, this one chapter has been changed, to just say, hey, I did this, and here's why I did it, for thematic reasons. And I don't think it changes the truth of anything. I don't think getting that interview early alters anything. But the big thing is, as you have to compress, because life is big. So what you can get rid of is anything that is mundane, anything that is non-novel, anything that's not going to change the central question or the nada meaning that you're after, and anything that the other people would not disagree with. And then you have to get rid of that for the reader.
Yeah.
So those are the things I think about as I take, something like a 5-year process and boil it down into 280 pages, is what is vital for this one story, which is a person, me, searching for the idea of home by interrogating Abby.
Right.
Everything else is secondary and can get rid of.
Right. Yeah, and that's the larger truth, right? I mean, finding Sean Prentiss within the search for Abby.
Yeah.
And it's a great book. And thanks, Brendan. This is Case Johnston. This is a Literally podcast. We're broadcasting from my home in Ogden, Utah. Today we're talking with Sean Prentiss, the author of Finding Abbey and many, many other books and essays and poems. Sean today is talking to us about his journey finding Abbey, but also on his biography journey and autobiography journey of finding himself as a younger man. And I think I have one last question, and that really is, now you're in Vermont. You're not in the West, and you're not in the cities. Where or how is place shaping your writing now? I mean, if it is, I mean, I'm making an assumption, but place with me is, my writing's all about place. But is Vermont shaping what you're doing now?
So where I'm sitting talking to you, I'm looking out. I have a double window up in my office, and I'm looking out at a lake, and then I have another double window to my right, and I'm looking out at a mountain. And it's not a big mountain like out west. It's a small mountain. It's an old mountain. And I'm hemmed in by all sorts of soft and hardwoods. And even that is a term I wouldn't have used out west. When I got here, I was like, what the heck is soft and hardwood?
Mm-hmm.
And it's merely deciduous and coniferous.
Mm-hmm.
And my writing is completely transformed living here, especially because I'm home here. I didn't expect to find home in Vermont. I shouldn't say I moved here for my wife, but I took an interview here for my wife. And when I landed in Burlington and drove to Norwich University for my interview, I was shocked by how immediately I was drawn to this landscape. And it reminds me of my home landscape, Pennsylvania. And it's a problem in the sense that, Finding Abbey came out as soon as I moved here. And I realized as soon as it came out, like, whoa, I was an expert or becoming an expert on a Western-based author and a Western landscape. And now everything I'm writing from here on out is going to be about home here in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
So every single project I've written since then is about here. And I'm learning a new landscape and, losing that old expertise and trying to build up a new one. And it's wonderfully exhausting, but I think it's really beautiful because I'm writing about the place, the environment that affects me. And, I'm an environmental writer, at least that's what I'd call myself. And that's about writing about how humans affect place and place affects human. And, I'm digging my roots into this Vermont soil, and Vermont is transforming me.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's just infusing itself in every part. Oh, and I learned recently about there's invasive species, there's native species, and then there's naturalized species.
Mm-hmm.
And we have trout in our lake, and they are not invasive, but they're not native. They're naturalized.
Mm-hmm.
So they came from Europe. They were stocked here, and they fit well into this ecosystem. And I see myself as a naturalized Vermonter. I'm not from here, but if I do it right, then I live within this culture and I live within this landscape,
right,
and I become a part of it. And all my writing naturally will spring out of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a lot of fun.
What's your big project? Do you have a big project besides the we have the textbooks that are coming out? What's on the more creative side that you're doing?
Well, the next book I have coming out is called Crosscut, Trail Building Memoir and Poems, and that's all about the Pacific Northwest. But then writing about Vermont, I'm working on a memoir about learning how to bow hunt.
Huh.
So my wife's aunt and uncle, my aunt's downstairs right now hanging out with my daughter. My wife's uncle is teaching me to bow hunt. So it's all about place and learning place through bow hunting. And then the next one is called Solstice. And this is a collection of poems that blend science and poetry. So every poem takes on some little natural history event, and it all takes place here on my lake. So what I'm seeing is that Finding Abbey was about finding my spot, which is Vermont and Turtle Cove, and then Hunting for a Home, if it ever gets published, will be about learning the Vermont landscape, and then Solstice will be about learning this exact landscape, specifically the plants and animals and scientific phenomena that occur right here. So I get smaller and smaller and smaller until I'll be writing about, a tiny little acre, and the reader will get really bored.
No, I don't think so. And so those are both coming out. That's one's coming out in 2020, Crosscut, right?
Yeah.
And then when was the other one coming out?
Well, I have to finish those.
No, you have to finish the bow hunting one, right? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, they don't have publishers yet, but I'm about halfway through that.
Okay. Oh well, I'm excited, and I hope that I get to see you this summer, and I'm glad we got to talk. I mean, we have to bump this butt back a couple times because you and I we would schedule something and realize, oh shit, we got something on our schedule that day, and so but I'm glad we got to talk. And
I have a hypothetical.
Oh yeah, Brand's got the last question of the day. It's always better than anything I have. I swear to God.
All right, hypothetical. All right, so of course it's the old you finally get to meet Abby question. First of all, what beer would you sit down with Abby with? What would you be drinking, and how would you lead off that interview?
Oh, those are great questions.
I told you. She always shows me up.
You had awesome questions. In case, it's awesome talking with you, and I can't wait to see you out at Right in the Rockies.
Yeah.
Gunnison, Colorado in July. Hope everyone out there listening joins us as well.
We should have Brandon bring his interview van and just interview the writers.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah, it would be great. So, okay, go on. Yeah, sorry.
Well, then Brandon, then you can take that van with me, and we'll go find Abby's friends and family, and we'll interview them as well.
That would be awesome.
I'm
too.
down. I'm so down. Yeah.
He's got one of those old school long. What do you call it? It's a
87 Dodge.
87.
Oh yeah, yep.
Camper.
So for beers, there's 2 beers. The first beer that jumped to mind would be a Utah-based beer, Polygamy Porter.
Uh-huh.
I think Abby would get a kick out of the name and that it's coming out of one of his homes. But he always drank cheap beer, and he used to determine how long a drive was by how many beers he could drink on that drive. And so I would also probably bring out some sort of swill, an Olympia or Rainier or a Yakima or a Coors. And then I would, try to figure out which he liked better, because I don't know if he would look condescendingly on my porter or if he'd love the new taste of it. And then, gosh, what would I ask him about? I might ask him about what we were talking about, just how do you write about family or not write about family? And a quick thing, Desert Solitaire, he was married and had 2 kids. I think both of his kids were alive then, living in Arches with him when he wrote it.
Yeah.
And none of them are in the book.
You never know. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah.
And it just might be, how do you do that? And what is the ramification from that? And is it worth it?
Mm-hmm. And why did he make that choice? I mean, he'd have to change the title.
Desert Family.
Yeah, desert playing solitaire.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a really interesting fact. Like, why did you? I mean, God, that would be a great conversation, wouldn't it? To sit down and just make this decision.
And he made so many decisions that transformed. I'll use that word rather than ruined, but transformed so many of his marriages. And I think his writing and his life choices, affected the people around him, and just, I can't do that. And you were talking about not being able to do that. So I just wonder how you can do that and if it's worth doing.
Yeah.
Because maybe we're wrong.
Maybe. I'm just not going to take the chance. Like you said, I mean, tell your students to be brave, but then, well, I mean, it comes down to what do you got to lose? If you got a lot to lose, you're going to take a lot less risks with your writing. I mean, I think at least with nonfiction, I take a lot of risks with my fiction, but that's not me. Right. And so, we can do it that way.
But my guess is what Abby would say is it's not about what you have to lose. It's what might be lost if you don't do that.
Right.
And what I think he'd be talking about is he and his family are one thing, and that's vitally important, but more important is the land itself and the rocks and the animals and the plants. And he might argue that doing those things was more important for those more global reasons, and that you and I are cowards because we think our family is the most important.
Yeah.
I will not make a different choice, and I don't think you will, but I would love to talk to Abby about that, which is something that kind of surprises me, Brandon. I thought maybe I'd think of something bigger or bolder or crazier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, that's
a good answer.
Perfect. And I'll bring the cores.
I'll bring the polygamy.
Okay. Yeah. Brandon beer shamed me last podcast. I had some Coors Light in the fridge, and he said, "You got anything else besides that?" And I said, I had to run up to the fridge, our main, because I have a beer fridge in my office, and then had to run up to the main fridge and grab something fancy for him.
A nice Uinta something.
Yeah,
it was
yeah.
an IPA something.
So, I've learned my lesson.
Well, I got beer shamed last night by my neighbor because I only had microbrews in there.
Yeah.
And he was looking for his Molson or Labatt's, and and he was disappointed to just see my good beer.
Right. Yeah. Well,
goes both ways.
It swings both ways, you guys.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you so much, Sean. It was great to talk to you. We should do it again, especially when the new books come out. Let's just plan on it.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, and we'll promote that one. We'll promote this one. and we'll just talk again. We could have talked for another 2 hours, but Brandon gave me the 5-minute thing. So, because he's the editor, he's the one in charge. I just get to read books and ask questions, and Brandon does all the work. So, no, we could have talked for another 2 hours, easy, because I have about 4 more questions that could have easily gone for another 3. So,
well, we are going to talk for 4 more hours or longer when we meet up in Gunnison, and we're going to go out to the brewery and sit down and have some beers and talk some writing and some life.
I'm excited. I'm going to write David like right now. And say,
do that. Tell him I say hi.
I will, and I'm going to say, hey, I'm in, right? So.
Well, and you can even tell him that I said you're in.
Okay, I will. I'll tell him Sean said I'm
in. How do we?
I have no power,
Sean?
but he'll get a laugh out of that.
That's a good idea. Sean, how can our readers follow you, find your work?
You can find me at SeanPrentiss.com, so I'm easy to find on the internet, and I'm at Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I just realized that I'd rather spend time with my daughter than checking up on social media. So you can find me there, but the best way is to just go to my website.
Okay.
And you can always shoot me an email. There's a contact page, and my email address is on there if you want to talk more.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it, and glad we finally got to talk again.
Thanks, Sean.
Brandon and Case, thanks so much for taking the time. I love talking with you both.